Welcome back for our Warfront session. Hope everyone had an excellent lunch break, got a chance to visit the exhibit, maybe talk with some of our first-class advisors, and is ready for the second half of our wonderful program. Now, as a reminder, at the end of the program this afternoon, we'll host a reception for you to continue conversing the opportunity to tour some of the exhibit still. So, just if you don't get your question in, just have a chance to engage with these folks as well. Now, before lunch, we heard about the African American experiences and contributions on the home front. Our next session is the General Raymond E. Mason, Jr. Distinguished Lecturer on World War II. Will focus on the battlefronts and overseas service. Now, the Mason Lecture Series is devoted to the legacy of America's largest war. It's made possible through the generosity of the late Major General and Mrs. Raymond E. Mason and the Raymond E. Mason Foundation. Now, Mason served in the European Theater in the 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army. Prior to retiring then in 1976, so quite a few years after the war, he held several high-ranking Pentagon positions. We would like to thank the Mason family and foundation for their continued support of this, the museum's longest-running series. This session will be a conversation between Dr. Kresge-Salter and Dr. Matt Dermott. Matt, we heard from earlier today, is the Frank J. Giuari Associate Dean of International Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies, it's a mouthful, and the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College. Matt is joined by Dr. Kresge-Salter. Dr. Salter is a retired U.S. Army colonel with 25 years of service to our nation. Of course, I think now it's 28 years ago we were on the faculty at West Point together to reveal our age. He's also a military historian who's worked at or with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, the 1st Division Museum and Research Center, the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History, of course, the Pentagon, and he served, as Corey noted, as our guest curator, side by side with Corey, to curate this revisioning of Fighting for the Right to Fight. Now, this work, the exhibit opening, our international conference, and now this symposium, has brought Dr. Salter back to New Orleans so often that seems like he's part of the team. And, frankly, we're proud to have both of you here. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in a nice welcome for Matt and Kresge.
Yes, Mike and I were captains together at West Point, so full circle. This is a conversation, so I will eventually be sitting next to Matt, and we'll have a conversation. I am an American soldier, so we're going to do TOT, time on target. You will hear an alarm go off, and that alarm tells me to ask only one more question, because what I want to do is throw the floor open to you all for at least 20 minutes, if not more. Not us to be talking, but we will get to talk a while. But sitting in my seat and listening to all of these great conversations this morning, it's kind of hard. You're like a popcorn and about to pop. I wanted to say a few things. So there's one thing that stuck out that's not quite on the program to me that I thought I would address. Matt and everyone already addressed it with double victory starting in 1942, but did it really start before 1942? Double victory was the name that was coined in 1942. So, I was thinking about setting the stage, and I have 4 quotes that I think I will use. The first one is from Abigail Adams, 1774. 1774, that's on the eve of the American Revolution. And I'm going to paraphrase these, so, if they're not word for word, understand that. But she says, and she's writing to her husband, John Adams, a future president. And she is also the mother of a future president. And she writes, it always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves daily for what we are robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we do. Of course, she's talking about the hypocrisy of the American Revolution. She's a white American talking about we are fighting for freedom against the crown, yet we are holding a people enslaved. Fast forward about 90 years and go to 1863, and Frederick Douglass says something to the effect, once let the black man get on his person the letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, let him have a musket over his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth that can deny him citizenship. Okay, fast forward about another 75 years, and there are about 3 or 4 quotes. We can use W.B. Du Bois, we can use A. Philip Randolph, we can use a Charles Hamilton Houston quote. There's a great quote that we use in the exhibition, and I didn't know who this gentleman was, but I think the crack team here at World War II found out that it might be actually Captain Kennedy who's that image on the front of the exhibition. But I like poetry and art, that's why you see a lot of artwork in the exhibition. But this one is by Claude McKay, and it's from a poem, If We Must Die. And he writes this in 1919, if we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood would not be shed in vain. We will fight like men against the murderous, cowardly pack, though pressed to the wall, dying, but we will be fighting back. And then that's my second piece of poetry that kind of relates to military history. But the last one, because this is World War II, gets to the issue of double victory and what I wanted to say before our conversation. And I've used this several times, but luckily we used the entire poem in this exhibition. And I quote this piece in my sleep all the time. And it's by Langston Hughes in 1943. And he writes it in 1943 because that is the most bloodiest summer. And it's from Beaumont to Detroit, or Detroit to Beaumont. I got to get it, which city is first. But that's when those 2 horrific, not riots as John mentioned, they're massacres, pretty much. And he writes, you tell me that Hitler, and I'm paraphrasing the main points of this poem, it's very long. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan, because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. So I ask you this question because I have to know how long I gotta fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. He writes this in 1943. So I say that to set the stage. When was double victory coined? In 1942. But African Americans have always been fighting for a double victory. And that's why the first exhibition I've had the opportunity to curate is entitled Double Victory, the African American Military Experience. That's the title of the exhibition at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it's broken down into 3 phases: the colonial period to the American Civil War, the Western frontier to World War II, the Korean War to the present, or post-Gulf War, however you want to go. Because in all of those 3 periods, African Americans have always been fighting for a double victory. Yes, they were willing to fight during the American Revolution, although many were impressed, as we know. Yes, they were willing to fight during the War of 1812. The last battle actually fought near here after the treaty was signed. The Battle of New Orleans was fought in 1815, I believe, and the treaty was signed in 1814. And they were willing to fight during the American Civil War and all points in between. But what they were fighting for, they were fighting for the side that gave them the best chance at freedom. That's why you had black folks fighting with the British during the American Revolution. Fast forward to the War of 1812, but fighting for the Union during the American Civil War. The double victory they were fighting for was freedom, because they were legally, and I use quotations, a people enslaved, but they were also willing to fight for the country that they were in. That's the double victory from the American Revolution to the Civil War. From the Western frontier to World War II, they did get freedom. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December of 1865. Then you had the 14th and the 15th Amendment within the next 5 years. But during that period, now they have their freedom, but they're fighting for those amendments to be carried out. But we have Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal for another 50 years, which starts on paper 30 years after the American Civil War. So they're willing to fight on the Western frontier. They're willing to fight in the Spanish-American War. They're willing to fight in the Philippines. They're willing to fight in World War I, and they're willing to fight in World War II when double victory is coined. But that double victory they're fighting for, we've already talked about it. And then from the Korean War forward, now African Americans and their allies are beginning to demand. That's what the Civil Rights Movement is. It's an agency to demand. So that's my stage setter. And Matt, I'm looking forward to, for the second time, Matt and I have done this before. The other time was virtual when I was at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. And I'm so pleased and happy to be with him in person, because I've read this great book twice now, from cover to cover, to make sure I'm prepared today. I don't want to rely on my 3.5-year-ago memory. Okay, so Matt, is this, okay. We're gonna stay on target. So it says we have 37 minutes for a conversation. Can you guys hear me? 1, 2, 3, can you guys hear me? Okay, so, earlier, and the reason I did that opening, I was thinking about it over lunch, is because early on you guys heard that Matt was not supposed to be on the conversation earlier, but we had 2 people drop out. So within 48 hours, he stepped in and did what you guys saw. So within 48 hours. So I said, well, you've answered 2.5 of my questions, although we will revisit those. So I'm going to take some time to just kind of do an opening statement, and you've heard the opening statement. But, and you saw his bio, your 5th or 6th book?
5th.
5th. And if you read the titles of those books, and I guess I should be, I'm having a conversation with Matt. I read the titles of those books, and they're, busing in the Civil Rights Movement, the making of roots. None of them, unless I missed it, deals with the military. Did I miss it?
No, you're right.
Okay, so my first question is, and you've answered it partially earlier, but I'm going to ask it again. Why, what brought you to this particular subject?
First off, let me say thank you so much, Dr. Salter, for agreeing to do this again. It's great to meet you in person. We did this on Zoom, and so seeing people in 3 dimensions is a real pleasure. And congratulations on the Fighting for the Right to Fight exhibit. I had a chance to look at it after lunch. It's really wonderful.
Right.
Thank you for that.
Team effort. Yeah.
So you're right. I'm not a military historian by training. All my work is on American history, African-American history, and history of civil rights broadly. And so I'm particularly interested in social and cultural history. So I've done work on civil rights in Philadelphia and the TV show American Bandstand, the miniseries Roots. You might remember Alex Haley's Roots. Busing for school desegregation in Boston, Detroit, Chicago, New York. And then the most recent project before this was on black newspapers. And so it really was, the image I showed, the soldiers from our town, was one of the entry points for me. I was doing this project, it's called Black Quotidian. You can find it for free online. It's a digital book project called Black Quotidian. It's blackquotidian.org. But the whole point of that was to look at black newspapers, try to understand how black communities experienced the 20th century as it unfolded. And it was drawn on the idea, Carter G. Woodson, who founded what was at the time called Negro History Week, his whole idea was that it was going to be Negro History Year, right? And so we're in Black History Month. The idea is to try to expand that to a study for the whole year. But in the course of looking at those newspapers, I kept coming across these pictures and stories about black troops. It was that curiosity that led me to do the research that resulted in the book. And I hope that my contribution to military history is looking at sources that haven't been explored as deeply as they might have in the past and trying to stitch together parts of the story that certainly have been told in different places. We've got good books on Tuskegee Airmen, good books on Montfort Point Marines, Doris Miller, but I didn't feel like when I was teaching, I had one book that could do both the military history and its multiple domains and also the home front. Right? And so my real goal with Half American was to try to write the kind of book that I could assign in my classes and write the kind of book that would give just ordinary Americans a better understanding of that time period from the black perspective.
Right. And I will say, so as a military historian, and I will kind of correct a little bit about my bio, I'm an American historian. My concentration as master's was on military history because like with Mike, I went to West Point and I taught military history, but I did my PhD in African American history. So I just merged those two, and I will say I really enjoyed this book the second time around even better because number one, the structure of this program, you've heard it, pre-World War II, John and Jeff did a great job. Then the home front, we are supposed to be talking, and we are going to talk about the battlefront. So Matt's book is an 18-chapter, all-inclusive book, pre-war, during the war, post-war, home front, and on the war, but we are going to narrow our discussion down to those 7, let me get my fingers, I'm not a mathematician, to those 7 chapters that focus on the military history. And what's great about your book is the way you weave all of this together. I mean, it's that military history, but also you have these great stories on the social, cultural, economic, and political threads that runs through. And so this is familiar to Mike, but I think you were an American side, but you guys probably use the threads as well. So this is a question you have partially answered, so I'm going to throw out 2 names. You've talked about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and why African Americans were actually in the war, so to speak, on the battlefield beforehand. So I'm going to throw out 2 names and just kind of talk about the importance of Salaria Key and Walter Garland, the nurse and the African American lieutenant. And what that meant.
Yeah, so the book starts with the Spanish Civil War and how black Americans were paying attention to the rise of fascism in Europe. So it's starting the story before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Langston Hughes, as I mentioned, became a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American. So he travels to Spain and reports on some of these 80 black Americans who volunteered to fight against fascism in Spain. And 2 of the people I mentioned, Walter Garland and Salaria Key, Walter Garland was one of the first black men to be an officer in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And so he's leading a multiracial international group of soldiers. And when Langston Hughes sees this, he's blown away. Given some of what we heard in terms of the history of World War I, he understands how important it is for Garland to be assigned this rank and assigned this command and to be leading his men so proudly as they're marching in review. And so Hughes's story on Garland talks about the shininess of the helmets and the crispness of the uniforms and how these men are marching in formation, but how important it is that you have people of all races, soldiers of all races, standing and saluting a black man, Walter Garland, because he understands in 1938 that was not going to happen in the U.S. Army. And so Hughes's point is that he wants to juxtapose the possibilities of what's happening in Spain with the reality of what's happening in the U.S. Salaria Key is one of my favorite examples from the book because she was the only black woman in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. She's a nurse. She tries to volunteer to serve in the Red Cross in Spain, but they turn her away. They say the color of her skin makes it more trouble than it's worth. So she volunteers for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade instead. She was a 23-year-old, originally from Akron, Ohio, and she did her nurse training in Harlem, in a Harlem hospital. And when Hughes catches up with her, he asks her, what brought you to Spain? What motivated you to do this? She's never been to Spain before. And she said it was 2 things. The first is that she is a Catholic. And even though she didn't consider herself particularly political, so it was her obligation to help people who were in need. And so when she read about peasant communities being bombed in Spain, she knew she had to do something about it. Then the other thing she said is that she worked alongside a number of Jewish doctors in the hospital in Harlem, and they told her about some of the atrocities of the Nazis in the Nazi regime in Germany. And so that too motivated her to fight in Spain because she understood that Hitler and Mussolini were providing men and ammunition and planes and tanks to help the fascists. And the other important part of that story about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade is many of those men and women went on to serve in the U.S. Army during World War II. So there's continuities there, and Solaria Key is a good example of that. She was a nurse in the U.S. Army during the war, so she's a veteran who had been fighting fascism even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad you didn't dive into someone else who was there, but we're going to get to a gentleman who served in the Spanish Civil War when we get to the war in Europe. But I think the key thing there is, Langston Hughes, and he was a part of my question, but you already answered that, he's showing the fact that you have, especially with Garland Walters, that an African American is capable and doing a great job of leading men and women of all races, creeds, and colors. And I thought that was a good story. And I only picked out a few because I think you tell about 5 or 6 stories in there, and one we'll talk about a little later. And that's chapter 1. So the next chapter that really dives into the military experience is chapter 5. Chapter 5. And chapter 5, and you alluded to some of it earlier, remember Pearl Harbor and remember Sykeston too. So what I want to talk about on the battlefield, let's talk about, the story of Dory Miller and how important his story is, but not only Dory Miller, if we can tie it to the Navy, how you do in the book, and I think we talk about it in the military, that a lot of people don't realize that just about every ship, the mess service, intended service was African American, but also in that chapter, you begin to talk about the number of African Americans that are killed at Pearl Harbor, which doesn't make it back home. So maybe address that. And when you talk about you weaving military history and social history, the sociological laboratory, I'm giving you kind of 3 or 4 questions here, and dive into that because I like the way you tell that story. And then the other 2 I'll save if we have time. But those are the 3, Dory Miller, but not only Dory Miller, but African Americans in the Navy early in the war, the sociological laboratory that is experienced.
Awesome. Yeah, there's plenty of work with there.
Okay.
So I'm going to do the same thing I do in my classes, so bear with me. Show of hands, how many people have heard of Doris Miller? That's awesome, right? So Doris Miller, I think, is probably the most well-known individual Black American to serve in World War II. So I'll go over the highlights just to refresh your memories. A young mess attendant from Waco, Texas, a big guy, right? Morning of bombing in Pearl Harbor, he performs heroically. As soon as his ship, the USS West Virginia, is hit, he starts to tend to the wounds of injured shipmates. He goes above deck, makes a makeshift stretcher, moves his captain to a sheltered space on the deck, and then when his lieutenant orders him to go to the anti-aircraft guns, even though he has no training on the ship's weapons, he goes over there and starts firing at the Japanese planes that are circling overhead, potentially hitting and downing one of them. It took several weeks for the Navy to release Doris Miller's name. It only comes through pressure from the Black press and civil rights activists saying, we know that a Black mess attendant performed heroically, tell us who it is. Part of the reason that story resonated so powerfully for Black Americans is that they understood that between World War I, as we heard, and World War II, the military has done almost everything they can to disparage the service, patriotism, and bravery of Black Americans. The report that John read, that is the official doctrine of the U.S. military. This isn't some isolated crank spouting racist nonsense. This is what they're teaching people at West Point. Those officers go on to become the leaders in World War II. And so for Black people all across the country, they see Doris Miller's story as clear evidence of just look, if you give us this opportunity, we have the ability to perform heroically in combat. Other important things about that story, within the U.S. Navy until very late in the war, Black men could only be mess attendants, where they did the cooking and cleaning aboard ships. Right? It was intentionally putting them in the lowest possible role. But as I think the bombing of Pearl Harbor evidences, and as happens later in the war, if you're on a ship, there's no non-combat role. Right? Once torpedoes start hitting your ship, you're in combat. And so that was the experience for Doris Miller and others. One thing I didn't realize going into the book, and my favorite thing about being a historian is you learn so much in the course doing the research, there are obviously dozens of other Black mess attendants who were at Pearl Harbor. Right? They died in proportion to the numbers on the ship. And so we don't often think about Pearl Harbor as being that kind of situation, but there were dozens of black men who died in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. One of them I talk about in the book, which was a name that was new to me, it was Julius Ellsbury. Like Miller, he was a young mess attendant, originally from Birmingham, Alabama. He was the first person, black or white, to be killed from Birmingham, Alabama in the war. He was on the USS Oklahoma. And his picture with the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was posted everywhere in black Birmingham after the attack. And so Doris Miller, Julius Ellsbury, these are the names that black people are talking about in those weeks and months after Pearl Harbor. But looking at the newspapers, some of what I showed earlier, they're also talking about black men and women being turned away from military service or trying to volunteer. They're talking about a lynching that happens in Sykeston, Missouri of Cleo Wright. And so these stories can't be disentangled. Black Americans desperately want to help the country win the war, but they also realize they're dealing with a whole separate battlefield at home. And so that's the kind of milieu, that's what's in the air in those months after Pearl Harbor. I appreciate you mentioning the sociological laboratory quote, because it's not a question I've often gotten, but from World War I all the way up into World War II, you have black civil rights activists, black newspaper editors fighting for the right to fight. They're campaigning for black Americans to be able to have a larger role in the military. And the pushback that they get from military leaders is, they say, and one of the quotes in the book is, "We can't do that. This is not a sociological laboratory." Right? Part of the absurdity of that is, of course it was a sociological laboratory, right? You're taking hundreds of thousands, millions of men and women from civilian life, throwing them into military training to create the largest armed force that the United States has ever seen. At the same time, you're creating the logistics to fight a war on this tremendous scale. So you've got people moving all over the country in service of the war effort. It was absolutely a sociological experiment, as long as it wasn't about race. Right? And so part of the through line through all the chapters and through the whole book, and I think through the presentations today, is that segregation made no sense for a military that was trying to fight and win a global war. I don't think we stop and say that often enough. It served no strategic or tactical purpose. Right? In fact, it was just the opposite. It was wasteful and inefficient. It was literally someone's job to make sure troops remained segregated. They had segregated dining facilities, segregated latrines, segregated living quarters. In Des Moines, Iowa, where some of the women Army Corps trained, they drained the swimming pool after the WWII women swam. Right? None of this made any sense. Right? And it was all wasteful, and it cost people their lives because they didn't take advantage of the full people power of American citizens. Right? I think slowing down and sort of thinking about, okay, yes, the military was segregated, and it made no sense. It was a terrible, terrible strategic decision.
Absolutely. And in the book, you go one step further, and I want to go ahead and kind of, complete what you talk about in the book, where they say this is not a sociological experiment. And then I forget which African-American diplomat said, but when you are sending Northern African Americans south, and you are taking them from an environment where there is some semblance of equality, but now you're putting them in an area where Jim Crow was very strict, is that not a sociological experiment? So you're right, the way you weave these stories in is great. And also, you talk about other folks in the book when you mentioned the Navy story. I think Alvin Bell is one of them. I'm not going to ask you to tell the story, but just to bring this full circle, and when we do the exhibition, and if you go into the Navy story, initially we had that image, which goes back to Matt's comment. Most people know Dory Miller, and like I said, I really like art, and we use a lot of Charles Alston artwork in the exhibition. I came across those maybe about 25 years ago when I first started studying military history. And what we decided to do was to use the Charles Alston image that actually tell the story of Dory Miller, Alvin Bell, and we also have the story of Charles French, who was known as the human tugboat. And there's a great story, if you haven't heard of Charles French. So it's not only Dory Miller, it's hundreds of African Americans who serve in the Navy. And in Matt's book, he mentions that on the USS Arizona alone, and correct me if I'm wrong, 24 African Americans just on that particular ship died, and that's not the ship that Dory Miller was on. One other thing before we leave chapter 5, because this goes to the sociological experiment, and it goes to John and Jeffrey's. Jeffrey was mentioning tearing the draft card. Would you like to tell the story of Robert Brooks, who was in the 192nd Tank Battalion?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So Robert Brooks was in a tank battalion that was stationed in the Pacific. And so with the bombing of Pearl Harbor was just one of the sites that the Japanese attacked in that raid. There were several others across the Pacific, and Robert Brooks was actually the first man killed from his unit in the attacks. He died on December 8th, I think, given the timing of when the attack happened. Robert Brooks was celebrated by the military commanders who came to the base and wanted to do a big celebration of his sacrifice in the war. And so they invited his parents to come in. I think his parents were from Kentucky, so they invited his parents to come in. It wasn't until his parents arrived that they realized Robert Brooks was black. His parents were sharecroppers, and he himself was very light-skinned. And so when Robert Brooks volunteered for military service, they assigned him to a white unit, not realizing that he was African-American, and he didn't correct them. And so it's a great example of the illogic of segregation and racial categorization in the United States. And I think to the military officer's credit, he still went through with a very laudatory statement about how brave Brooks' sacrifice was. But there was no sense of irony, because as he's saying this and how it's important for everyone to work together, he's saying it on a segregated base, in a segregated city, in a segregated state, in a segregated military. Right? And so I think it's a great single story that encapsulates the kind of, for lack of a better word, the craziness of racism and racial categorization during World War II. And nevertheless, you still had black men and women in the thousands who were sacrificing themselves for this cause.
Absolutely, and I'm sure you've come across it in many other, research settings that stories like this happen quite often. Where it's not until something happens that you realize that this person is African American or not white. Okay, so we are going to progress to chapter 7, and that chapter is entitled Dirty Work in Distant Lands. And this goes to the point where, most African Americans in World War I and World War II who served were not in fighting units, but their job was important nonetheless, absolutely critical, to success. So Matt, talk to us about the 96th Engineer General Service Regiment, and kind of tie in when they actually arrived and maybe some of the political and social aspects of assigning them in that region. And then the second point is maybe talk about the 93rd Engineer General Service Regiment as well.
And you have to forgive me, it's been a couple years since I worked in that chapter. I know one of the regiments is in Australia and one's in Alaska.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I think the stories are similar. So part of what happens, particularly earlier in the war, is even though the U.S. military is very reticent to use black troops, they still need black troops in huge numbers to do a lot of the logistical work that is going to be needed to fight and win a war on this scale. So part of that is building runways, clearing fields, making it possible to stage the kind of battlegrounds they're going to need to stage in the Pacific. So they deploy one unit to Australia, but it takes weeks of back and forth diplomatic negotiation because Australia at the time has a white-only immigration policy called the White Australia Policy. And so even though they're desperate for more Allied troops to be there, they initially say, we don't want black troops. Send us white troops, not black troops. After 3 weeks of back and forth, eventually the U.S. says, these are the troops we have, this is who we're going to send you. Those troops go there and they do the laborious hard work of clearing forests and jungle to be able to build runways that make it possible to have the U.S. planes and Allied planes be able to take off to help the Allies get a better foothold in the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. The reason I title it Dirty Work in Distant Lands is because it's not glamorous work. Right? This is not the kind of storming the beach, frontline combat that is easy to celebrate in movies and in Hollywood stories, but it was absolutely vital to helping the U.S. and the Allies get a broader footprint in terms of their war capacities. Mm-hmm. The Alaska story, I think, is even more interesting because there you've got troops who are building this 1,000-mile-plus road to help increase the supply routes to make sure that you won't have Japanese incursions coming through Alaska and then eventually into the continental United States. But a similar situation emerges. The white commanders who are there initially don't want any black troops sent to Alaska because they've thought about it as being the great white promised land that they want to maintain for after the war.
Right, yep.
And so you've got black troops there that describe their treatment by their white officers as being as though they're in slavery. Right? They're working, all this kind of logistical supply work was hard, but the tenor of the work combined with the tenor of the racism that they experienced from their commanders, their common point that they kept saying was, this is like as though we're in slavery again.
Right.
That's early in the war, but I think it helps to lay the foundation for the kind of logistical and supply effort that remains vital throughout the story of World War II.
And the reason I wanted to talk about the timing, when you look at when American soldiers were deployed overseas, there are some regions where among the first American troops to land in a location were African American, because they had to do some of the press work, the prep work. And you see that throughout, and I know in your book you use Ulysses Lee as well. That's one of my Bibles. All of us as historians, we have certain books that are Bibles on our shelf, and I'm a Longueuil military historian, so that's one of my World War II books. Jeff and John's book is one of my Bibles for World War I, and then yours is added to that for World War II now. But in Ulysses Lee, there's a couple of charts in the book that talk about on some of these small islands, over 80 to 90% of the American soldiers on those islands are black soldiers. So you know what the other 10 or 15% are. They're probably the officers or the senior NCOs. So that's very key to realize. And the fact when you talk about it, I know you mentioned this before, being key to the victory, preparing runways and building areas where people could live and where ammunition could be stored. And then they were also a part of the island hopping, not necessarily storming the beaches, but we'll get there when we talk about the Mumford Point Marines. So I think that's very key, and I'm so happy that you were able to weave that in as well. So I'm going to skip down from that particular chapter so we can get to some other discussions and go to chapter 11. And it's entitled Combat, and this is the chapter where you talk about the Tuskegee Airmen.
And in many ways, things are building up to that point. 1943, you have 2 years of African-American civil rights activists, newspaper editors, calling for black Americans not just to be in the military, but to have the opportunity for combat. Tuskegee Airmen, that we've heard about previously today, started as an experiment. Initially, even before the war starts, the Army Air Corps is allowing any black men to be pilots. They say no to it completely. Through pressure, they agree to establish a training base in Tuskegee. There's a debate whether it's going to be in Chicago or Tuskegee. Some people favor Chicago because it would be integrated. Eventually, they decide on Tuskegee, Alabama. Those men and women who train at Tuskegee, the pilots are there for nearly 2 years training before they get a chance to deploy. And they're going through the same training missions over and over and over again. And one of the things I read about in the book that I didn't realize in this kind of detail is there's a whole world of black excellence that develops on the airbase in Tuskegee. It's not just the pilots, but you've got hundreds of black mechanics. You've got hundreds of black women who are nurses there. You've got meteorologists, people with STEM backgrounds from MIT who are doing the weather forecasts. Right? And so when we talk about the pilots or the airmen, we're really talking about the whole support staff that makes it possible for them to take flight. Finally, in 1943, the airmen deploy to the Mediterranean and get their first chance at combat, which they've been eager for over a year. And they perform well in combat. But unlike a lot of white pilots, not only are they fighting against Nazi pilots, they're also in some cases fighting against their own commanders. Because in their after-action reports, some of their white commanders say, these black pilots, they don't have what it takes. Right? They aren't natural flyers. They don't have the instincts to be able to perform well in combat. They're too timid. This ends up becoming a congressional investigation, a congressional hearing on whether this experiment is working or not. It's in major newspapers and magazines. Something you would never, ever see for white servicemen or women at the time, right? Questioning the capacities of these black pilots. Thankfully, they both sort of stage a PR campaign to stay fighting long enough to prove themselves. And then in the Battle of Anzio in early 1944, they score the kind of victories that they need to be able to finally persuade their more reticent commanders that they have what it takes. And I think at a more technical level, the kind of flying they were often asked to do was tremendously demanding because they had to be extraordinarily disciplined to be on the wings of those bombers, right? All the while they know that they're fighting not just for themselves, but for, quite literally, the ability of black men to be pilots in the future. Had they failed, it would have been a whole other generation before black men had the ability to be fighter pilots.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's, and each time they go into the air, their stories show up in the black press, right? And so there's that, again, connection between the battlefront and the home front. People are rooting them on from small towns, big cities all across the United States.
All right. And, the black press is so important. In the exhibition, I think we have the black press mentioned in just about every chapter, and you have the black press mentioned in a lot of your chapters to include this particular chapter, and it seemed like there were more African American and white press eyes on the Tuskegee Airmen than any other unit. And also to your point about Tuskegee, still today, for every fighter pilot that goes up, even if he or she is a single-seater, it's 7 to 9 people on the ground to get that aircraft flying and doing its mission. Tuskegee Army Airfield, although it only had just under 1,000 pilots, it was 1,500 people on that air base, and they all consider themselves Tuskegee Airmen, although only about 1,000 were pilots. And then something else you mentioned really just stands out, and you do allude to it in a great way in the story. Imagine this: Davis is the commander of a combat fighter pilot unit, and he has to go back to D.C. This is in World War II. You're not getting on a 747 and going back and then coming back within a day or two. He has to go back to D.C. to defend what has been written about his unit. So think about that as well when you're talking about the different scenarios that an African American unit or commander may have had to deal with, and then the discipline. One of the reasons that the Tuskegee Airmen ended the war with a stellar record because Davis was so hard on his pilots, he told them, you're not going to go off and do these thrill-seeking missions to shoot down a German aircraft. We're going to skip forward, but I really wanted to talk about the Merchant Marines. Maybe we'll talk about those guys later. But let's go to Chapter 14, D-Day. And not only the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, but dump truck units and other units. There are almost 2,000 African Americans who land on D-Day on the actual day.
Yeah. D-Day, obviously, the museum starts as the D-Day Museum. June 6, 1944, perhaps the most iconic battle in the war from the U.S. perspective. There are about 2,000 black Americans that land on that day itself. I think most famously, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. So if you look at pictures of the Channel crossing, you see these kind of funny-shaped silver sausages floating in the air. Those were called barrage balloons, and they were tethered to the ships by long cords, and they had wires dangling from them that had mines attached to them. And the purpose of those was to make it difficult for German planes to be able to drop low enough to strafe the ships they're crossing the shore or to strafe the troops as they were coming onshore. There was a combat medic in that unit named Waverly Woodson, who performed heroically on D-Day. He was wounded as the ship was coming to shore, but he set up a medical aid station on the beach and worked for 30 hours consecutively, tending the wounds of more than 230 men. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but it wasn't awarded. During the war, there were 433 Medals of Honor awarded, and none went to black troops during the war. But part of what I try to show in the book, too, is that D-Day, of course, just stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and it was really the weeks and months after June 6th that turned the tide of the war for the Allies. And that's where the vital role that black troops played in the supply effort became readily apparent. The Red Ball Express that is mentioned in the exhibit was a group of black truck drivers that moved ammunition, food, and fuel across France and eventually into Germany in those weeks and months after D-Day. They moved 400,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel. It's remarkable work. And part of what you can see when you look at their work is that almost everything the Allies moved to the front passed through the hands of at least one black American. Now, without these black supply troops, the logistical supply effort would have ground to a halt. Ollie Stewart, who was one of the other black war correspondents, called this the miracle of supply. And he said, this isn't glamorous work. These men don't get to drink champagne or kiss happy girls. But when things become critical, the first cry of high command is give us more supplies. Right. And so one of the arguments I try to make in the book is that World War II wasn't just a battle of strategy and will. It was a battle of supply. When you see it from that perspective, the absolutely vital role that black troops played becomes really apparent, and really America and the Allies couldn't have won the war without this black supply work.
Well, absolutely, you do a great job in the book, and I think you also say in the book, but I heard you say this on a program, that, without the Red Ball Express and the number of African Americans who were a part of that supply effort, beans, bullets, and fuel, it would have been extremely hard, if at all, for the Allies who are actually fighting for it to do their job and perhaps get into Germany as soon as they did after the Battle of the Bulge. So let's catapult forward to Victory in Europe chapter. This is where you talk about the 92nd Division in Italy. You talk about the 761st Tank Battalion in Europe. And this is where you bring up the story again, and this is where I want you to talk about Edward Carter, but also some of his background. So those three points, kind of talk to those.
Yeah. Let me start with the 761st. So the 761st was a tank battalion, nicknamed the Black Panther Tank Battalion, and they fought for 160 days consecutively through 4 major campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge. And one of the things I like in the exhibit is it talks about the importance of leadership. So one of the things that's notable about the 761st is they had a white commander, like many of the white units did, but their white commander, a man named Paul Bates, really respected the men under his command. And the men fought all the harder because of that. It should be obvious to say, but it mattered a great deal whether the black men and women felt like they had the respect of their white commanders. And so the 761st, I think, is a great example of a unit that felt like they had that kind of support. And then as tankers, not dissimilar to the Tuskegee Airmen, they proved that black men had the ability to manage this machinery in ways that a lot of white critics would have doubted. And in contrast to the 92nd, their white commanders were typically not showing the kind of respect that one would want to see for troops. And it really hindered the performance that the 92nd could do. That was one of the most debated units that served in the war. Right. I appreciate you asking about Edward Allen Carter Jr. If I had to vote for the most interesting person to fight in World War II, Edward Allen Carter Jr. would get my vote. So give me a couple minutes to kind of tell his story a little bit. So he was raised by black missionary parents in India and China. And so he is fluent in Hindi, Mandarin, and German in addition to English. When he was 15, he left home to join the Chinese National Army to fight against Japanese incursions in Shanghai. He volunteered for the Spanish Civil War, like I mentioned earlier. He's one of those volunteers. And all that's before he turns 21 years old. He volunteers for Army service before Pearl Harbor. And you would think with that combat experience and language skill, the Army would have a good role to give him. Instead, they assigned him to be a cook in a quartermaster unit, which I think speaks to the illogic of segregation. They weren't interested in what capacities he had. They were only paying attention to his race. Nevertheless, he serves in that capacity until late 1944, when the Army is desperate for more frontline combat troops. He was one of 5,000 black men who volunteered for infantry duty just to have the chance to fight in the front lines. He actually gave up his rank, went from being a staff sergeant back to being a private to be able to do that. He's assigned to provisional infantry unit, fighting alongside General Patton. And in March of 1945, he performs the actions that earn him the Medal of Honor. He's with a small detachment of men who are facing fire from German troops who are stationed behind a warehouse. 2 of the troops who are with him get shot immediately, and so he ends up leading a single-man charge across a field. It takes him 2 hours as he's zigzagging. He's pinned down multiple times. He gets hit several times. Eventually, he's pinned down. 8 German troops come to capture him. He pops up, shoots 6 of the German troops, and captures the remaining 2. And I mentioned earlier he's fluent in German, so he interrogates these 2 German troops he's captured in German as he's leading them back across the field, getting valuable intelligence about where the rest of the German troops are, helping to save lives of men in his unit. It sounds like Hollywood movie stuff, but he actually did it. Right? It's just a remarkable story. And thankfully, he's one of 7 men who was promoted from the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor in the 1990s.
All right. And number 1, correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, Carter's Medal of Honor is in this exhibition. The National WWII Museum has the medal. And also, this is a chapter where you interject the 1925 study. I'm not going to recount that. John did a great job this morning, but it alludes to the fact, juxtapose that to Edward Carter and what he was all about. And in the exhibition, one of the things that I wanted to promote when we talked about leadership. I didn't want to talk about everything being negative. So we have 5 more minutes. I'm going to ask one more question. So there's a portion of that exhibition that is entitled Leadership Matters for a Reason. And the decision was made to talk about white commanders who treated their soldiers fairly. And Paul Bates is one of the studies, and Noel Parrish, who was the white commander at Tuskegee Army Air Base. Because throughout history, one of the things that I always try to get across is that community, coalitions, and people are not monolithic. You go back and look at African Americans during World War I, people like to think that everybody fell in line with W.E.B. Du Bois. No, there was a guy named A. Philip Randolph, and a lot of people followed his direction, and perhaps rightly so for them. So let's jump to the last chapter, Victory in the Pacific. Certainly hit on the Mumford Point Marines. I think those stories in the book, they're really great. And, maybe interject some stories about the black press, because their experience with the press was a little bit different than what was going on in Europe, a little bit more positive.
So the Mumford Point Marines, taking a step back, at the start of the war, the Marine Corps isn't allowing any black Americans to serve in any capacity at all. The Commandant of the Marines at the start of the war says he'd rather have a Marine Corps of 5,000 white Marines than 25,000 black Marines. And so he's adamant they're not going to serve. Through pressure, finally by late 1942, they established a training base at Mumford Point near Camp Lejeune to train the first black Marines. And I think what's notable about their story is they eventually get to deploy to the Pacific Theater, and they fight the battles of Iwo Jima and Saipan and elsewhere. And I think to the Marine Corps' credit, they evolve in those few years. There's a new commandant of the Marines, and after these black Marines perform highly at those 2 battles, he says, these were Marines 100%, right? Race doesn't matter for them. They're fighting side by side with white Marines, and they've shown themselves as to be fully Marines. For the Mumford Point Marines themselves, they do describe that once they got back out of battle, some of the racism was still there, so I don't want to say that it wasn't. But the Marine Corps from 41 to 44 made tremendous advances there. Mm-hmm. I think, again, part of the story of the importance of the black press in these stories is that there were a number of units that had black war correspondents embedded with them who were able to write about the bravery and the heroism of these black units as they're doing this work. The 761st had a man named Tresvant Anderson. The Mumford Marines had people writing about them. And I think when you juxtapose it to white newspapers of the era, if you look at New York Times, Chicago Tribune, you have hardly any idea that black Americans were serving in any capacity. And so part of the reason black newspapers are such an important source is they talked in great detail about many of the units that we're mentioning today. Right? They talked about these stories. And so we can sometimes fall into the trap, and I do it occasionally myself, of saying this history is unknown or forgotten. It obviously wasn't unknown to black people. Right? People knew these stories intimately well during the war because it was written about in their newspapers. And the challenges, and a number of the black journalists and scholars immediately after the war recognized that those stories were intentionally pushed out of the recollections of how the country started to talk about the war in 46, 47, 48. And so part of our work as historians, I think, is to recover and recenter this work so future generations know about it.
Absolutely. And, one of the key points I think we want to make sure that is pointed out with the Mumford Point Marines on Saipan and Iwo Jima especially, they were supply troops who were actually going in on the first waves because their mission was to bring Marines ashore. But then, of course, if you are bringing them ashore, you are caught up in battle, and then ultimately some of them do end up fighting as infantry, you could say. And we have a great image that a lot of people have seen throughout the years of black Marines on Iwo Jima. That's one of the images that we selected for this particular exhibition. And talk about being written out of history. I was going to say this earlier, but in the interest of time, but I do have one more minute before I throw it open, is the barrage balloon battalions. For me, that's one of my favorite, and they're my heroes. I knew of that image for about 10 years. Somewhere in the mid-'80s, I saw that image. Okay, D-Day, I'm reading about it. But now when I go to graduate school and I'm going to study history, but also military history, then I learned that the unit on the other side of those balloons are African Americans. So I've always said this, that one of the most iconic World War II history images, and so this is me, everybody else has their other iconic image, I'm sure. One of the most iconic World War II images that we have seen, and even in movies, African Americans were there, you just didn't see them. And that has happened in a lot of history, except in the last 10, 15 years. It's great for historians like Matt, like Marcus, like Greg, John, and Adrian, and Jeffrey, and others, to bring those to full circle. So with that, I promised at least 20 minutes. It would be selfish, I think, for me to just continue to sit up here and ask all the questions of Matt, because I do know from earlier, we have a lot of folks in here who have great and informed questions. So with that, I'm going to throw the last 20 minutes open to the floor.
First question will be here in the middle.
Thank you. Very good presentation. Matt, I was wondering if you could speak to the role of service and supply troops in Great Britain, black troops, prior to D-Day. There were about 137, 140,000 in Great Britain prior to D-Day. For the most part, doing those same things, but because they were in Great Britain and it was a very social part of that presence there, I wonder if you could talk about that in terms of how their presence as service and supply troops and the issues that arose from being in Great Britain prior to D-Day.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for asking. So one of the most common things that black veterans talked about was how positively they were treated in Great Britain. They said it was like a breath of fresh air. In part, they just meant that it wasn't the same kind of strictures of Jim Crow segregation like they experienced in the United States. Which meant that they could go to any pub they wanted to, dance with whomever they wanted to, eat at whatever restaurant they wanted to, didn't have to step off the sidewalk if a white person passed, like they might have in Mississippi or Alabama. And so the kind of treatment they experienced from people in Great Britain, they felt like they were treated as Americans, as potential liberators. Problems emerged because white troops wanted to instill the kind of American-style segregation that they expected to be the norm. And it led, as you mentioned earlier, to racial clashes and racial attacks in Great Britain between black and white troops. One of the quotes I have in the book is that they said it was a, excuse me, a good thing that the D-Day invasion happened when it did, because otherwise these race riots might have gotten out of control. Right? So things were that tense in the summer of 1944. But in terms of the supply effort, those troops are the lifeblood of the supply chain on that side of the channel. They're the largest port, I think it was the port of Southampton, becomes the largest port in the world in those months after June 6th. They're the ones that are supplying all the ships that keep coming across. Those are 75% black troops, right, who are doing that work. And so I mean it quite literally that everything the Allies moved to the front passed through the hands of at least one black American, whether it was on the English side of the channel, whether it was unloading those ships when they crossed, whether it was the Red Ball Express. To fight and win a war at this scale, everyone deserves credit for it. Right? Obviously, the troops that were in frontline combat absolutely deserve credit, but they needed the bullets, the food, the fuel, everything that the tanks and the trucks needed to run was being handled by black men.
Next question will be in the back.
This is so very interesting. Now, we saw the image of the barrage balloons, but those of us who don't really understand how they worked, can you explain how they worked and what was the process that these men went through to even attach them to a boat, a ship, I guess? And
Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I should say there's a good book on this topic by a historian named Linda Herveau called Forgotten that goes into this in great detail. But they're large silver balloons, hydrogen-filled balloons. They were tethered to ships or held on the shore by long cables. And then from those barrage balloons, other cables were dangled. And those cables had explosive attached to them. And so you had the men on the ships being in charge of attaching the wires and making sure that they were not getting tangled. And then when they landed on the shore, they were holding them down to keep them on the shore or hovering over the shore so that German planes couldn't drop low enough. But because winds are unpredictable, it wasn't just like sending up a test balloon. They had to figure out, okay, what height do we fly it at so we're not hitting our own planes? Which way is the wind blowing today? And so they're doing this work not just during the Channel crossing, but then for weeks after D-Day. And as Dr. Salter said, you can look at those pictures and see these kind of funny shaped sausages floating in the air, these silver sausages, and have no idea that there are black troops who are manning those. And so it's one of the, I think, less heralded stories, but it's a fascinating insight into one of the ways that black troops were part of the D-Day invasion.
Can I jump in and add some? Have you been to the exhibition? Okay, so that is a great question because one of the interpretations that we do in the exhibition is the 320th, and there are actual artifacts in an exhibition, so you can see what was used to hoist balloons up. And so we actually have what they trained on, which was a generator, but because a combat load on an LST and other crafts, while they were in Europe training, they came up with makeshift way to get the balloons up on the beach, and that's where you see the wire reel, and that's what they used initially on the beach. After the invasion, they go back when they're defending the ports, and they use those generators. And interestingly enough, there were several barrage balloon battalions in the U.S. military, and some of them were white barrage balloon battalions. And the 320th was one of 4, if I'm not mistaken, of African Americans that were used. And as Matt said, there's a great book that goes into detail about a lot of these individuals who served in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. But their mission was to make sure that the German planes had to fly higher than normal so the accuracy of dropping the bombs would be off whatever was left of the Luftwaffe. And as Matt said, you know, they had explosives. You hit that wire, the explosives are going to come up and destroy the plane and or tear the wing off the wires. It would tear the wings off as well.
Next question will be to the right.
Fascinating. I work for a museum, and I do consider myself a storyteller. And I think this question is for both of you, but I'll start with you, Matt. In terms of the socio-cultural component of your book, I'm charged with trying to bring back 3 best practices to my museum community. What should I be incorporating or interpreting, or how should I be interpreting these stories for my exhibits so that people become not only just moved by it, but, you know, shift their thinking and action to advocacy for my museum or advocacy for those who are now represented in the museum but weren't before, and build community. How do I do that?
Thank you so much for asking. So, stories particularly about World War II, you saying? Okay. Yep. I mean, I think capturing something of the personal element, I think always resonates so powerfully with people. I think it's one of the things that the museum does so nicely, is trying to remind people that while millions of people fought, these are each individual stories, right? Individual stories on behalf of a much larger story. And so any way to find connection points there, whether those are local connection points that would resonate with your community, or stories. So I like the Rosa Parks example. Names that people might know well, but might not know they're connected to the war in some way. Thinking about things that change our fundamental understandings about something we think we know well. And so one of the things I think is important about everything we're hearing today is that it's not just, oh yeah, there were some black people in World War I and World War II, right? But if we take these stories seriously, it fundamentally changes what we understand the war to be about, right? It changes the chronology of the war. It didn't start in 41, didn't end in 45, but also the clarity and urgency with which black communities fought the war. Right? I think it's part of what is important about the Double Victory campaign is that for a lot of average white Americans, they were fighting a single victory campaign. Right? They wanted military victory and then go back to the way things were. Right? That's why there was such a conflict in 1945, is they had 2 radically different views about what the country should be. Right? I think those are useful points to bring through. And then I think today, I guess evidence is always important. I think particularly today, evidence is important to remind people that history isn't just a a debate where you can make up whatever you want to, but we have to ground our interpretations of the past in facts and evidence. And so I think getting people familiar with what does that look like, what kind of evidence do historians marshal, and how do we put those puzzle pieces together in a way that is relevant to non-professional audiences, I think is really valuable.
Okay, I'll keep mine really short. My first one dovetail on what Matt just ended with evidence, because what I wrote down is, as best you can, try to use as many period quotes or interpretations. This is if you're doing an exhibition. See, the thing about an exhibition, it is a science project as well, because you have this much story, and then your space is going to be this much. So evidence, but let the people of the era, as best you can, talk to you. And then the other thing, you talk about agency and advocacy, inclusive stories. You know, that there is this polarization all over the world, but I always, and I said it before, that no people is a monolith. You know, so also use stories like the story we use on Leadership Matters. That was a conscious decision that I wanted to recommend not to have a story about Edward Ullman and others again. So, you know, make the stories inclusive, you know, that together is what makes victory, especially on the battlefield. And then the last point that I wrote down, let me see where I wrote it. I think I turned my paper over. Maybe that's why. The last point that I wrote down is unvarnished truth. You know, if you're using the evidence of the period, you know, make sure that, you know, you tell the unvarnished truth. It's not to try to make something harsh or something pretty, but tell it the way it was as best you can in the space that you have.
Next question, we'll say to the right when we're in the back.
Hey, Matt, got another question for you regarding your research for the book, right? So I doubt the racist or illogical decisions, strategies that were deployed in World War II surprised you. I mean, you're a historian, but I'm curious, what things did surprise you as you conducted your research? What did you come across that just kind of maybe stopped you, or maybe there was an aha moment?
So I had no idea that the supply story was going to be as large as it was in the book, that the Red Ball Express and that kind of large supply effort, the troops building roads and everything, the Lido Road in Burma, I didn't know that was going to be as large of a story. And so I went down these rabbit holes about things like how many horses the German army had. It turns out the idea of the Blitzkrieg, for folks who are military historians, they would know this already, but for the idea of the Blitzkrieg is overstated, right? The German military by 44, 45 was struggling to keep up with the pace which the Allies were fighting the war. And one of the ways that was true was that they had more horses than they had trucks. Right? And so part of the story of the Red Ball Express is not just that you have this amazing truck convoy, but that once the French rail system is in ruins, the Germans have hardly any way to move anything quickly because they're doing horse and buggy, right? Whereas you've got this fleet of trucks driven primarily by black truck drivers that are sending goods all over across France and eventually into Germany. Those kind of nuances were not anything that I anticipated being as large and important in the book as I anticipated.
Next question in the center with John.
Oh, thanks. Kowalski, I don't know why you mentioned Nate Allman at the last second, but this is sort of a statement and a question to both of you. It struck me as I'm listening to what you folks are saying and what Jeff and I were dealing with in World War I, that the 92nd Division in both world wars is commanded by racist, out and out racist. Jeff told the story for World War I. You just mentioned Nate Allman, who is the commander of the 92nd Division, appointed by George C. Marshall, who was himself a racist about African American troops, who was on record as saying to Edward Stimson, Secretary of War, if we're going to deploy black combat troops, we have to deploy them to Greenland in the summer when it's daylight all long, so that they would be willing to stand up because of the notion they would be afraid to fight at night, which is horseshit. Okay, World War I disproved that. Marshall should have known better, but he's on record for that, and so he picks a racist to command the 92nd Division, which actually delivered a couple of Medal of Honor awardees, namely Vernon Baker, who was the other. My two favorites are Carter and Baker. And it's this sort
And
of...
John Fox.
Fox, exactly, so the two. And what strikes me is that it's no coincidence. Marshall was there in Europe in World War I and totally ignored what black units actually did as opposed to what the 92nd Division officers said they hadn't done, and perpetuates the lie into World War II. And fortunately, I'd like you to talk a little bit, because you mentioned this. Who is it that actually decides that in 44, 45, under Eisenhower's command, that they need to put black troops into combat and then goes out and recruits them? And I'd just like to hear a little bit about a guy I don't particularly like personally, but I love his name. It's J.C.H. Lee.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ himself, as he was known to his soldiers. But he's the man who said, we need to do something about this. So just sort of interweave that, because the thing that struck me was, why do we do this again? It's because of Marshall. Yeah. They could have changed, but he was a VMI product, as was Nate Allman, and so same type of general in World War I and World War II.
Thanks, John. It's a lot of good points there. And one of the connection points that we've spent some time on here that is really important is the idea of leadership, right? And so one of the bad decisions that the U.S. Army made was that they thought white officers who were either Southern or who had experience with colonial troops in Latin America or Central America would be the best to manage these black troops. They thought they knew how to, quote unquote, manage the colored populations, right? And I think that had predictable results. So you had people who had racist upbringings, racist beliefs that treated their men without respect, and it worked to the detriment of the morale of black troops. But the other thing you just asked about is the people made choices, right? They made choices about what they were willing to do, what they're willing to stand up for. And by late 1944, part of it's desperation, right? They literally need more frontline combat troops, but also it took people to stand up and say, look, we have a solution to this problem. If we go and recruit black troops, they will get the job done, right? And there are enough stories like that that I think give us an opening to understand people made decisions that were more forward-looking rather than more backward-looking.
Okay.
Okay, another question towards the right.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a question about General Benjamin O. Davis. And he's often held up as this example of African-American success in the Army. But can you speak to the experience that he has in navigating the interwar years and then what he goes through during World War II?
Yeah, he's one of the main characters I feature in the book. I try to tell the story of the Tuskegee Airmen through Benjamin O. Davis. For folks who aren't familiar with the name, he is the first black graduate from West Point in the 20th century, only the fourth overall. His father eventually became a general, and so he's about as from elite black military family as it's possible, right? That he's right at the peak of that. His experience at West Point was harrowing. He described being ostracized and that people wouldn't talk to him for the full 4 years he was there. But nevertheless, he graduates from there. His desire throughout is to be a pilot. He's fascinated about the idea of flight because he got to go on a test flight when he was younger. But when he graduates in 36, the Army has no idea what to do with him because at that point they won't allow any black men to be pilots. So instead, they signed him to be an instructor at a black college, a military instructor at a black college. But he becomes the focal point. He becomes the first leader of the Tuskegee Airmen experiment once it gets established. And then, as Dr. Salter mentioned, he recognizes the importance of them doing everything at 110%, right? Because some of their initial commanders try to pull petty tricks on them, right? They'll say this meeting happens at 2 o'clock when actually it's happening at 1:30, right? So they'll intentionally will make it so that they're late, which really pisses them off, right? But I think the kind of discipline and work ethic he instills in the men under his command, and these men are also coming from tremendous backgrounds who come with a real sense of purpose and fire. Davis, I mean, he's about as patriotic as a person as you can imagine, but he still describes it as being a hellish experience, both the training in Tuskegee, a lot of his experience in the military. He's titled his autobiography All-American, but recognizes that that has always come with caveats, that he had to fight every step of the way to be treated as a full citizen.
We have time
And I
for
was
one.
going to mention that book, that's a good one to get. And John, you also mentioned you were getting to the replacement platoon point. Yeah, so, that letter was written, interestingly, the day after Christmas of 1944. And J.C. Lee, and of course, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. worked for him at that time. And so basically, the Americans had lost so many soldiers between D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge that in order to continue forward, they needed more infantrymen. And that's when supply soldiers such as Baker, that you so eloquently discuss in your book, men like him volunteered to take a reduction in ranks and go forward and fight.
We have time for one last question. We'll be here in the front.
I'm beginning to feel, as a white person, I'll just say, whose father and uncles and many were flyboys, famous in both the Pacific. My uncle was shot down in a P-51 over Italy, survived. And I learned from you that when my dad was on an island, all the people who took care of those runways and so on and so forth, many of them, were black. I never heard that from my family. I'm beginning to believe that erasure of history is a cultural thing. I hate to say it. And it's happening again. And I'm going to take us back to the beginning of our history, which is we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. And I don't know how many people know about Alexander von Humboldt, but his book in the Cosmos was rejected from coming to America when he went to talk to Thomas Jefferson about why he denied information about slavery. So it goes all the way back to that. Moving forward real quick, a person who was really appreciated Humboldt, who named Humboldt in the West, where I'm from, Fremont, was actually the first person to emancipate slaves, but that was never revealed. 1861, 2 years before Lincoln. His history was hidden. So I'll just stop at that. So I just think you can comment how you want, but this erasure of history is an underlying theme that I'm very concerned about. Thank you.
We'll do one more right in the front.
I'd just like to know why it took so long for the Montfort Point Marines to be recognized.
I mean, I think that the two go together in different ways, right? So I think importantly and frustratingly, the erasure of certain parts of our nation's history have been a through line, right? It's been it's one of the reasons it's been so important for black people especially to tell our own stories. I talk about in the book, immediately after the end of World War II, the story of World War II starts getting written, right? And black people start getting written out of it, right? And so the reason we don't know about the Montfort Point Marines immediately after the war is that efforts are made when the first big books on World War II are written to not talk about them, right? With the Tuskegee Airmen, they take it upon themselves to tell their own stories, right? They start holding reunions in homes in Detroit, holding their own reunions. I think with Montfort Point Marines, it's a similar thing. People know their stories. They're not willing to let their stories be erased, but it takes a full generation for them to be able to start to get their stories into the mainstream. And it takes exhibits like the one we have here, it takes historians like the ones we have in this room, and it takes average citizens who are willing to learn these stories and share them with people in their communities so that we make sure that despite other high-level efforts to limit what we know about our past, that we refuse to let these things be silenced.
And I would just like to end. You can come up, Mike, but this exhibition, because I know you want to cut me off here. I think that's why this exhibition is so important. And my hats off to the National WWII Museum for putting this exhibition up. And I believe it's going to travel. So for those of you out there and you talk about agency, when the exhibition is up for to be rented or sold or whatever the term is here, advocate for it to come to a museum near you and invite people to come and talk about that exhibition and go beyond what's in the exhibition, because an exhibition is a science project. I can guarantee you that there are twice as many pictures on the cutting room floor that's up in the exhibition. I can guarantee you that the 25-word, the 40-word, the 75-word interpretation around an object in an exhibition, there's a book and an article behind it. And someone can come to your town, your school, and actually have a series of programs just about one particular part of that exhibition. And the other part to your question is not only the Mumford Point Marines, and it's not only African Americans, not Denise, but the MIS, the Japanese Americans who fought in the Pacific, the white women pilot, the WASP, although 2 of them were Asian Americans, and the 6888. There are a lot of other units that it took a long time for whatever reasons, but for African Americans, a lot of it was the eraser of history. Matt talks about this in the book. He didn't mention it today because we have a small amount of time, but he talks about the fact that photographers were told not to film, and I've seen this in Ulysses Lee and other books, where there are African American soldiers make sure they're out of the shot. And I appreciate Matt for also getting that into his book as well.
So ladies and gentlemen, join me in a round of applause for Matt Delmont, Steve Salter for the great conversation. So I'd invite you all to join them outside for book signing. We'll kick off again at 3:45 for the closing session. But again, let's give them a round of applause for a great conversation.